Welcome to a discussion with Advait Sarkar and Ian Drosos regarding a participatory prompting study specifically designed to understand generative AI-assisted data analysis workflows. We're going to be a bit more, let's say, high level in this discussion, not as technical as some of the other ones. So if you're interested in some of the soft aspects of how to run these kind of investigations, this interview is probably for you. It would be useful, I think, to give some background. Why did you decide on doing a participatory prompt study to begin with? And maybe if you could introduce the concept of what that really means.
Okay, so it started really the method comes from the research question. We wanted to understand what opportunities and challenges there are for people who are doing data analysis with tools like Bing Chat or Microsoft Copilot or ChatGPT. And there are a number of different methods that you could use from a human-computer interaction perspective to do that. You could interview people, you could do experiments, you could do what's called Wizard of Oz prototyping. And we found that this wasn't quite flexible enough for what we wanted. We kind of wanted people to deeply use a tool, but not use it necessarily in the way that they would normally use it. We wanted them to use it kind of in the way that we think it could be used for data analysis. And moreover, we wanted to smooth over some of the issues with user studies where people are using these generative AI tools, but they don't actually get to properly engage with it because they get hung up on things like prompting strategies and small aspects of the interface that aren't kind of relevant to the underlying research question of what is the opportunity or challenge. So we developed this method, participatory prompting, and it's a fancy name for a technique that at its core is basically somebody uses generative AI, but a researcher is there to help them write their prompts and help them think very carefully about what they're doing and what the output of the AI is telling them.
Mm-hmm. Does that translate in some way to systems that are currently in place now? Do you know if that kind of approach is actively being used with the generative AI models that are sort of emerging now? I could imagine that people can misuse chats that you have, for example, on websites, and that it might be useful to have some intermediary in between. Do you know if that's actively being used right now, or if this is purely an academic way of approaching, these kind of studies?
Well, we don't know if this is being used more broadly than our own team, but this is the sort of first publication that actually describes what the method really is in detail with an example. But we're hoping that this is something that could be applied not only in research, but also in basically UX design of these sorts of products, because so many software companies are integrating various forms of generative AI into their products now. And they usually have groups of user experience designers who are doing not academic style research, but user experience research, talking to customers, figuring out what they want, how they're using the system. And this method could help them, I think, understand a little bit better what their customers want and need.
Okay, so it's a form of requirements gathering. It's not actively, you're not envisioning it to be actively in the development process necessarily, or maybe in another form, but what you're talking about really now is sort of getting feedback on UX that has already been published and that you want to assess. Is that understanding correct?
Essentially, yes. It's sort of it's the strength of it is that we're using an actual system that actually exists, which means that people's reflections on what the opportunities or challenges are grounded in some real experiences of some real technology. But the aim is to identify challenges and opportunities. So those opportunities might not just be, oh, like we could improve this chatbot that's in our software right now. The opportunity could also be, hey, there's this entire gap for like a product that we need to build that's, kind of separate from what we have right here. So it's not just necessarily about iteration on an existing product, although it could be used that way. And I think that's probably one of its most widespread applications.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the scoping of the study. So, off the bat, with the formulation that you've given so far, you could make this incredibly broad, in my opinion. So, we're saying so far that we have some expert that's interacting directly with the system. We have some participant that's not at the same level of savviness, let's say, when it comes to prompting these systems that would then come in. Are you restricting yourself in the studies to some particular scope? You mentioned data analysis in the beginning. Is that the core focus, or are you also allowing for other kinds of investigations? Could you maybe elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I think our goal was for data analysis workflows. When we did the recruitment, we asked for them to kind of bring some scenarios that they work with data as potential primer for our study. But during the study, we kind of let them just come up with anything they were interested in. So some of them wanted to think about building a business plan or some marketing plan for their business. Some of them wanted to look at generating code for doing data analysis, and some of them wanted to generate things around like strategies for doing data analysis, or sort of at like a higher level. So it was just open to what kind of drove the participants, in that hour and a half that they had with us, as opposed to saying you need to do data analysis, but it was still in the domain of data analysis.
Okay, okay. We can have a look at the tasks in a second on the table that you listed those. I would just ask before that, when it comes to data analysis in particular, do you know if there are any emerging tools that sort of bridge the gap from an out-of-the-box generative AI model into something that's more tailored perhaps for those kind of applications? Like, is this, if we're talking about this from a data analysis point of view, is a model like Bing or ChatGPT something that you would actually use in such a specific scenario?
Well, I use it all the time when I'm doing my own data analysis, just kind of without any extra, things around it. But we've also had a paper recently come out around for WIST, that's around the AI kind of giving you its assumptions more explicitly, and then you can kind of change those assumptions so basically you give it a data set, you tell it what you want to do, and then the AI gives you the assumptions before it does the task, and then you can manipulate those. And so we were working with our intern Majid then, and he created a couple prototypes around the idea of intervening in those assumptions and changing them and kind of steering the data analysis whichever way that you thought it should go. Um, so that's one sort of more applicable way of doing this.
Mhm. Okay, so we have two tables now that I would like to have a look at. We first of all have this one, the participant summary table, which outlines the candidates that were in scope. Did you have a particular selection procedure for this? Like, was there some vision for what kind of people we were looking to include in the study?
Well, we wanted participants basically with a range of generative AI experience. Um, the participants that we recruited um, are recruited from people who have expressed an interest in participating in studies with our group, um, and usually what unites them is that they kind of have some sort of data analysis requirement as part of their day-to-day work, and usually use spreadsheets. So you can see the spreadsheet experience scores there. There's nobody who's at the very low levels of spreadsheet experience, one or two. Most people have at least some amount of, well, there's one person with two as a spreadsheet experience, but they're also a software engineer. So these people are people we've picked to basically have some regular experience with doing data analysis, but a wide range of experience doing generative AI.
Mm. Okay, understood. And then the next one would be the actual tasks that these people were assigned. So my understanding is you gave them the description of the task, but they were also somehow contributing to this. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on what the setup was around that?
Yeah, yeah. So first, what we did was kind of prompt them and ask them what kind of work with data do they do as part of their day-to-day workflows. And then when they worked on one, so we didn't actually come up with these tasks themselves, they did. So one might say like, oh, I'm doing a literary analysis. So yeah, maybe I'd be interested in working with generative AI today to work with spreadsheets. So then we asked them like, okay, what are your considerations that you need when thinking about doing a literary analysis? What's like the goal you have with this first prompt? And so then in that next column, first prompt is basically what we did to help them craft their first prompt.
Mhm. Okay. And you're approaching this then from an like anecdotal point of view, I guess, with the feedback that you're getting from the end users. Because it's a large question of tackling how my understanding of the formulation of what you're trying to do is that you're trying to see how you can improve how non-experts in generative AI can leverage this technology for data analysis tasks. And are you approaching interpreting the results of this study in some particular way? Because you have a lot of examples and they span multiple different kinds of tasks. To get clarity in what the key takeaways from the study is, what's kind of the philosophy you're approaching that with? Is it to look anecdotally at each case and try to see what the most common examples are, or do you approach it in some in a more structured way when it comes to analyzing what what you find in the study?
Sure. I mean, I will say we were motivated to get externally valid, what we would call externally valid examples, i.e., examples that participants actually would care about and are problems from their own lives, which is why everyone had a different one. Mainly because that increases the realism of the exercise of using generative AI. If we had, for instance, set a task, then it might have been a task that participants saw as artificial and didn't really care about. And so the point of getting them to come up with a task that they were actually going to be working on in real life, and then tried to do that during the study, is so that they can actually kind of consider the implications of using a tool in this way for their actual work. So that's that. I wanted to add that to what Ian said previously. And in terms of the analysis, yes, I think this is a fairly standard method of trying to infer some level of general insights about the nature of interaction with the system from a collection of specific examples. And the specific examples are really important because they kind of add they help to add clarity to the sort of general principles that we infer. It's like when we say things like people had barriers in prompt formulation, like what does that mean? And we can have 5 or 6 examples from different contexts to say, these are examples of what we mean by barriers to prompt formulation. So that's the general sort of process of theory making in human computer interaction research that we followed in this case.
Mm-hmm. Very good. When it comes to the things that the participants actually brought to the study, do you have some examples of what kind of additional material they provided? So my understanding is they could, for example, bring documents to the study that were their own and that they wanted to further analyze. Was it restricted to like PDF documents or something like that, or did you have a wider scope of things that could be included?
I'm trying to remember. I know the apartment hunting organization one, she showed us her spreadsheet of her list of apartments that she was considering. So we might have used that as part of you putting it into the prompts and write me a letter for these landlords that I'm interested in asking so and so questions. But some of them generated data by using GPT or Bing Chat instead.
I
I
would
think
say
that's one clear example.
I would say that there are a few participants who brought spreadsheets basically with them because they're spreadsheet users and they have their data in spreadsheets. Other participants did refer to other documents that might have had elaborations of concepts that are important to them, but we didn't get to see them. We got to see some spreadsheets that the participants brought. So as Ian says, in apartment hunting, we got to see the spreadsheet that has that had that data about apartments. that the person was looking for. In the literary analysis example, that's P12, we had a sort of example where the participant had come up with a framework already for analyzing narrative text, and they were trying to, I guess, compare and contrast with what the model would produce. So we saw the example of what that participant had as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we can maybe go to the to one of the figures that we have on prompt formulation, because I think it's, well, the proper context to maybe discuss some of the challenges that people were facing. So maybe if we just look at the initial figure here, it kind of shows the two steps that mediate this process. And please correct me if I'm getting something wrong here, but you have the mediated prompting, which is where your participant then communicates to the researcher what they want, and the researcher comes up with a prompt for that and puts it into the system. And then afterwards, there's a reflection stage where you discuss this with the researcher before returning to the original part of formulating a new prompt. What
Yep.
was some of the challenges, in your opinion, that people had interacting with these systems? Was it off the top of the bat mainly related to not being familiar with how these systems, quote unquote, think, that people are not used to interacting with generative AI systems in general, and that a lot of the confusion was mainly around how to formulate a good prompt or what information is relevant, or was it something else?
Yeah, I think one of the major things is, and that they brought up, and that we report in the paper, is understanding the amount of context you need to give, an AI before it understands exactly, the kind of format you want from it, what exactly you want for your goal for a task. The more broad you are, and some participants even said, like, the way that we were prompting the AI is something that they wouldn't normally do, because they would say hi to it and exchange pleasantries, and then kind of be broad about what they want and like iterate with it. Whereas we were pretty detailed about, exactly what we wanted, and what kind of data we had, giving it all the context. And so that was one of the major barriers that we found in the study, that was difficult for our participants to kind of think about providing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did you experience that the lack of context was more prominent in some of the questions than others? So, for example, if the participant has a spreadsheet, was the context more or less relevant in that case compared to some of the others?
I think so. For like things like writing some code, you can be a little more generic. Um, Whereas when asking for different literary analysis strategies, there was one that Bing Chat had recommended that they knew wouldn't work for the data that they had. I believe it was like thematic analysis, and they thought like that was just something they would have never done, but realized that if they were more explicit with that context, it never would have probably been an alternative that it would have recommended. Um, so yeah, I think there probably are more context hungry prompts out there. But yeah, I guess it depends.
Do you think there's some way of proactively taking context into account? So I think some of the suggestions from participants was that you could, for example, load an entire, I don't know, a directory or whatever it might be that contains a plethora of documents. Do you think that would be a viable approach to solve this problem if you could dig through the amount of data contained? Or do you think the solution is improving these systems in some other way to make it easier for people to provide the necessary context?
I definitely think that would go a long way towards it, especially for people whose workflows are such that a lot of their workflow is digitalized and captured in the documents that they work with. There are cases where that's not the case. There are cases where the participant simply either doesn't have clarity around what their context really is, what they're asking the system for, and that's why they encounter a kind of almost sort of blank page terror when they see the blank chat box. or it could be that they have that context in their head, but it's not written down anywhere, so they have to spend a lot of time kind of writing it down as part of the prompt. But there's definitely examples. I mean, in our examples, people tried to copy and paste things from their documents into Bing Chat as a way of getting better context, or like helping them provide context more quickly. So column headers from their spreadsheets, for instance, very valuable piece of context. I think it's kind of a no-brainer that we should be able to slurp up whatever we've got already digitalized to help the model. Of course, you've got the problem of garbage in, garbage out, right? If the stuff that's in your documents isn't all that helpful, or if there's a sort of needle in a haystack problem, you've got a giant document and it's not really obvious which portion of it is relevant to the prompt that you've asked for, and it wouldn't really even be obvious to say a human reading that document, then you can't really expect the language model necessarily to work it out either. So there's still going to be missing pieces between what you have and what the AI needs to know.
The aspect of having a researcher in the loop, was your experience that significantly helped the process? Like, do you have similar studies to this one, but where you let participants interact directly with the system? Because that's arguably another way of approaching it. I don't know how large of a delta in terms of effectiveness you actually get from having a researcher mediate this interaction.
So I think there's advantages to having a researcher mediate the interaction. The ones we observed included things like helping draw participants' attention away from sort of incidental aspects of the interface, or incidental aspects of the way in which the output was couched. But in terms of prompting, I do think that we were able to. So we've got a finite amount of time in these studies, and the objective of one objective of the mediated prompting is to maximize the sort of relevant experiences that participants have with the tool. So things like, one of the strategies that we applied for prompting, for instance, is explain how to do this in Excel with an example, and that's part of the prompts that we developed as part of the process of developing the prompt book, which is demonstrated with the little book like sort of page icon in the figure. And that is actually really helpful, because a lot of the times, if you didn't do this and it didn't give an example, then the next follow-up prompt would have been, please give me an example. And in a study setting, that would have essentially wasted a turn, which meant that the overall number of turns and the number of reflections we could get from participants about what was useful and what wasn't would have been lower. Of course, this comes at a trade-off, because we're kind of interfering in the process of prompting with the system. So there's a question of, well, are we actually observing a behavior that would have happened in the field, as it were, or is it just something that's come about because we intervened and offered this prompt for them? So I think that's a subtle balance that we were kind of negotiating throughout the study, because we wanted to intervene in ways that we thought were productive for the research questions we had, but not in a way that would kind of distort the actual findings. And it's an open question as to how successful we were in doing this. And that's a kind of limitation that we discuss in the paper as well.
Mm-hmm. I would like to follow up a little bit on the queries as well. So you have this query book that you were referencing before. How did you go about acquiring that? Is the I don't know if I should call it a field or not, but the area of generating good prompts well mapped out, in your opinion, or was that something that you approached from a blank slate when you tried to conduct the study and really build up expertise as you were preparing for it?
Yeah, what we initially did was we thought of different things we would like to use generative AI with, and we would just iterate with the AI and see what prompts worked best, and then kind of look at the changes we made to the prompts, and then kind of analyze, well, what did we actually add here? Oh, we added context to this. We told it kind of the format we wanted it in. And then we ran a few pilots separately, and then also came back with kind of the issues we had with the prompts, even through this mediated prompting. And I iterated on that book again of prompting strategies that we would use in the study. Yeah.
Okay. Are there particular like keywords and stuff like that that have emerged to be useful when querying for specific things? So I haven't looked into this in detail, so maybe I'm posting a stupid question here, but from my perspective, it seems like if it hasn't been developed already, there ought to be a field or like some guidelines or heuristics around how you structure specific queries in specific areas. So if we're talking data analysis, for example, I would assume that there are some pretty specific terms you could use to increase the probability that the AI actually provides you with the kind of output that you're expecting. I know, for example, with the GPT-4 models now, you can demand that you get a JSON response, for example. It kind of goes a little bit away from what my original question was, but the point I'm trying to get to is still the same. Whether you're aware that you can craft your queries in specific ways, and if there are heuristics that have been established for this to really get more control over what the output is. Because from my perspective now, interacting with some of the generative AI models, you might ask it something, especially if you're using an older version, and even if you have something specific in mind, it might go off on some idea of its own and provide you with a long text, for example, that's not necessarily tailored to the application that you were envisioning.
Yeah, I think you hit on two really interesting aspects. You used the word craft the prompt, and then you talked about different versions. So it's definitely right. The writing good prompts and prompt engineering as a discipline is basically a craft practice. It's not a science. There's different levels of rigor to which you can do it, but the essential method is try different things and see what seems to improve the output. Right at the most rigorous end of the spectrum, you've got basically formal benchmarking. So you've got a benchmark set of tasks and an example of what success looks like on those tasks, and then for each prompt you try, you measure how well the AI does on the benchmark, and you use that as a way of kind of optimizing your prompt for passing some benchmark, right? So that's the most rigorous, but actually it's much more common for people to feel it out qualitatively to see, am I getting better results if I use these kinds of words? Am I using better results if I use these others? I think one of the seminal things that opened up the field was the what is known in the academic literature as chain of thought prompting. And that has the very famous phrase, let's think step by step, right? And the authors found that if you just add that phrase to models, the prompt, that actually improves the correctness on a bunch of benchmarks, which is really interesting. Another place where you get it is in specific communities. So, for instance, in visual art, mid-journey and stable diffusion are really important models for the communities of visual artists, right? And early on, I think with mid-journey, somebody figured out that you can get hyper-realistic images by using the keyword AutoCAD render or something, or like it was like a render keyword, right? Which didn't necessarily have to say, which didn't necessarily mean make this hyper realistic, but it was kind of like a hack. It's like, this is a keyword that the model associates with hyper realism, and it's like a reliable way of making it do that. So these things are very much craft practices. Somebody will try something, figure out what works, share it amongst a community. So where that fits into our process is that we were kind of starting from a set of these known kind of best practices, like the let's think step by step example. We started with that, but then we wanted to make a code book that was really specific for our case, our use case of data analysis. So taking the sort of known strategies into account, we set about doing a similar set of examples where for a few weeks, Ian, I, and a few others, we tried different prompting strategies on data analysis tasks with Copilot and a few other systems, documented what worked and what didn't, and then tried to come up with some consensus of what we think is a good set of prompts for the final prompt book.
Mhm. Did you find in that study that the different generative AI models respond similarly to the same prompt, or was there a large variability depending on which kind of model you use?
I think there's a lot of variability. Different models are well, they're trained on different data, they're fine-tuned in different ways, and it's not just the model; it's like the package, right? So in some cases, you're not interacting with the model; you're interacting with several layers of wrappers around the model, like Bing Chat or like ChatGPT. You're not just directly calling an instance of GPT-4. You've got heuristics and guardrails and all sorts of things that are kind of mediating your relationship with the model. And each of these are so different from system to system that the prompting strategies don't always translate.
Mhm. Okay, so we talked about providing the context when you're prompting these systems. Was there anything else that stuck out to you as either a challenge or as something that worked unexpectedly well with this kind of study?
Okay, I could say another challenge, and Ian, you could say something that went unexpectedly well. So I think, yeah, the challenge is there's two buckets. Ian already talked about the input bucket, which is prompting is hard. There's another big bucket, which is output, and that's reading the output and figuring out whether it's correct and whether it's what you want is hard. Um, so in a nutshell, when you're reading the output of the language model, there's so many things that challenge you. Firstly, these things tend to produce a lot of text, and you've got to read a lot of text. Secondly, you've got all these things you need to check. You need to check, has the model understood what I want? First thing. Second thing, has it made any like factual mistakes or hallucinations? Like, has it just got something wrong? And third thing is, how do I know whether it's done a good job or not? I mean, it might not have gotten anything factually incorrect, but is this really going to help me do my data analysis task as best as I could? And people have to do this again and again and again for every time they say something to the model, and then they have to read the response and they have to think about all these things. And that is a big challenge for them and is something we think could be better supported.
Mhm. So Ian, I would let you answer the unexpectedly well question, but I would like to dive into this one a bit deeper first because I think it's a big problem overall while interacting with these models. What is your best suggestion for how to get around those problems? Because I think those ones affect everyone that's interacting with these models at the moment. You want to make sure that you don't have hallucinations. You want to make sure that the model understood the prompt that it was given and responded with accurate information in mind. Do you have some ways that you found to be effective of tackling these problems?
I'd say a couple of our participants mentioned, and this is one of, I guess, the advantages at the time of using Bing Chat was kind of the references that Bing Chat was providing. They inspected them for kind of quality and familiarity of, oh, if it's from like a journal that I know and like it's respected, I'm more likely to trust what the response was. However, you still probably need to actually read both to make sure that AI is not just linking it and then saying, of course, this is what this journal is saying. So I think, like, yeah, like using verified and robust sources that the users already trust can go a long way with, we didn't just craft a response from all of the data that's available to an LLM. We crafted it based on the data that you trust personally. And so, yeah, that could just be internal data, or that could be data from external sources that you think are worth pulling from. Advait, I don't know if you have any more.
Yeah, I would say like the factual errors, the hallucinations bit is the one that seems to me the most likely that we can solve using technical advances. So there's evidence that the larger models with better data have a lower rate of hallucinations. But we don't just have to rely on the scaling thing. We can also use techniques for what's now called grounding, where we can try and make sure that the model's statements correspond to statements made from verifiable sources in a way that is actually sort of algorithmically enforced, as opposed to just something that we optimize for in the training and we hope that it does it most of the time. So I actually think the hallucination part is going to be less of a problem. What I think is still going to continue even with the technical advances is the sheer amount of stuff that people will have to read and decide whether it's good enough or not, and whether the model actually understood what they want. And I think there's obviously some things that we can do to help here. One is start with the prompting phase itself. Make sure that they're able to explain their prompt better with more context, so that they spend less time having to fix models' misunderstandings further down the line, which is something that they iterated a lot on, which is like just adding extra bits of context in after, in subsequent turns to say, actually, no, not like this, or not like this other thing. If we can anticipate those kinds of things while they're, for instance, writing their first prompt, then that's something that can really help reduce the number of times they have to reread like new, slightly different answers. There's ways of structuring the answer as well. So if you've got 5 requirements that you ask the model, like, hey, write an email and make its tone really good and like make it have this subject. The output, instead of just producing the email, could also, for instance, annotate it with this is your requirement and this is how I fulfilled it, in this place and this place and this place, so that you have some guidance for how to read through it, rather than you having to refer back to your original thing and think, okay, has the model done what I asked it to, again and again. So I think there's interaction design opportunities to reduce the other burdens, but this is stuff that we have to build and explore and test.
Mm-hmm. One consideration just that came to mind when you raised this way of formulating the question is, do you find that if you ask the model to give an account for the kind of steps that it's taken to actually fulfill the requirement, is your experience that the quality of the result also increases as a consequence? Like, do you know if there's a correlation between the two of those? Because naively, I could expect a situation where you give actually a complex set of instructions to a model and it kind of neglects a few of them and doesn't actually incorporate them into the solution strategy. But if you actively ask it to elaborate on how did you fulfill each and every requirement, that it's somehow taken into account more thoroughly. Is that well, do you agree with that vision, or would you say it's just me, or that it's just an idea?
Yeah, I would say the research on this is mixed. I have another paper that was at CHI earlier this year that's called Large Language Models Cannot Explain Themselves. I think in general, so there have been some studies that are cited in that paper that have found that basically if you ask a language model to explain itself while it produces an output, that it does a good job of it, basically. But there's other studies that have found a different thing. So I'm not sure whether we're just seeing differences in what different models are capable of, or whether this is like a general deficiency of the models. But absolutely, you're right that in certain patterns of language production, it's like the think step-by-step example. If we can induce certain patterns of language production in the model while it's producing its output, then we can perhaps make it be, for instance, more attentive to all of your requirements. I mean, but there's so many levels to this, right? There's the prompting level, and there's also the further into the model. There's the attention mechanism. So there's parameters. How much of your parameter space is allocated to the attention mechanism? How many attention heads do you have? All of these things will also be ways of addressing this issue of you've got 5 requirements, but it didn't always pay attention to them.
Okay, good. I would also like to follow up on the grounding that you mentioned before, just in terms of how that would be implemented. So you have this grounding approach as a way of circumventing hallucinations. Is that something you see would be part of the actual models, like contained within the plug-and-play solution that different parties would supply, or is it something that would be applied and to be like an external check?
Yeah, so there's different ways of achieving grounding, but one of the ways to do it, and I think there's citations for different ways of achieving grounding as well in one of our papers, but one of the ways to do it is actually to have a separate checking module that basically uses old school AI or old school NLP to take statements that the model has generated and then cross-check it against statements in its verified source database to say, the model said a cat sat on the mat. Does the database that we consider to be our oracle of truth also say the cat sat on the mat? If so, then this is a well-grounded statement. If not, then we reject it and say, ask the model to try again. So those are kinds of techniques that you can use.
And would that be more or less literal then? Because potentially, if you have a generative AI model that comes up with an answer, it's not a one-to-one match to anything that you would have in that database, unless the database that you have internally is really huge. But how would you do that matching in a reliable way? Are you saying that you would do like semantic like cosine distance checks on it, or something like that to see how contextually similar those two statements are? Because if you do, then I think you also lose some of the necessary granularity of the accuracy, right? So like what I see is a trade-off there between having to explicitly check whether string statements match, for example, or if you allow a relaxation of that criteria, then you once again kind of open up the avenue for things being similar in terms of what the sentence itself conveys, but maybe the result, the most important result of that sentence is still altered.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm not an expert on grounding methods. All I know is that that there are various approaches that people have proposed here. So I think there's different levels of sophistication that you can apply to assume whether one statement really reflects a fact from a database or not. And you're absolutely right that if the literal sentence or claim that you've got isn't actually contained in the database, then you need some way of mapping a sentence to a different kind of representation that you can look up in a database. And that mapping in itself is going to lose some subtlety or nuance. That's part of the statement that the language model produced. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So I'm not sure if there's a way in general to think about the transformation of language and semantics in a way that catches all edge cases. But you can build sort of mappings that do a pretty good job for, again, measured in terms of benchmarks and in terms of corpora. So you have a list of examples for where you think, okay, this is what it means for a factual statement to be well grounded or not, and then you kind of use that as a benchmark to see how well your system is at detecting correctly grounded or incorrectly or not grounded statements.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's very interesting. So I would jump back to the question I had before then regarding something in the study that you found worked particularly well. So was there something that surprised you in that domain?
Yeah, I would say I think it's like section 4.2 in the paper about how data sense making was supported by generative AI during the study. And I mean, I'm always really excited as an HCI researcher when a participant gives a quote and we see it and we're like, yeah, that's the title of the paper. And so that's participant 12 likened generative AI to a rubber duck, but that talks back and is useful. Referencing rubber duck debugging, which is common in software engineering. And it's like such a cool metaphor for what generative AI can be. But instead of you just talking your problems out and hoping that your mind kind of connects to alternatives or new hypotheses you'd like to test, generative AI is generating potential alternatives for you to explore. And so a lot of our participants were really excited using it to look at alternatives to what they thought was a direction they wanted to go. But now that they had this, they could quickly and easily generate alternative approaches, and then they could test them really easily by learning from the AI how to do them, and then maybe even having the AI provide examples to them of what it might look like. And so, yeah, a lot of our participants were really excited about this, kind of function that generative AI provided to them.
Mm-hmm. were there any specific prompts that you found to be particularly useful when it comes to getting the generative AI model to maybe highlight certain things that the participant might have not considered?
Not particularly. I mean, I think explicitly asking for multiple alternatives is something that works out. But also, if you ask it how to do something occasionally, if there's any kind of downsides, it might also recommend other alternatives. And to that effect, asking for well, what are the downsides of using this approach, and are there other approaches that um, alleviate this could be another way to do that. Um, but yeah, I'm not so sure on specific ones right now.
Okay, that's fine. In terms of the last few minutes, I would sort of hand it over to you to talk about any things you've found that we haven't maybe covered yet. So just trying to wrap up the study as a whole, if there were any important parts of it that we haven't discussed in the interview that you think were really key takeaways for you personally.
I guess part of this is kind of something we've already covered, but it's around like uh, the difficulty of providing context to an AI. And one participant kind of talked about like when he talks to other people in his lab, they understood a lot of the context that he's working in because they use the similar methods. They, kind of talk to each other throughout the week. And that's something that the AI, at least if we only look at prompting as our interaction with AI, is pretty much never going to be able to, mimic or reach the level of what humans can provide. So I think like the natural language interface and chat that we have now is great. It's really simple, and like a lot of people can use it. But obviously, there's still barriers, and there were still barriers even though we were helping people prompt. So I think there's a lot of room for innovation in how people both form prompts, but also how maybe they don't need prompts. They can interact and get things from AI that they might not have otherwise been able to do because prompting's not easy, and even when you try to help people do it, it's not always perfect.
Is there anything looking forward that you think would be useful to do as a follow-up study to this, or something similar that you think would be nice to investigate?
Well, I mean, lots of things, right? So I think Ian mentioned that we saw participants kind of discovering new things that they could do. And I think that's one of the things that we often overlook. So these sorts of tools that they're typically presented as ways to help you get your work done faster. But people don't, I mean, sometimes that's what people want. But it turns out that you can actually get a lot of value not just by using it as a replacement for your work, but also using it as a creative ideation partner, as a rubber duck that talks back, as something that can help you learn, as a tutor. And often that stuff happens on the job. So all of that creative ideation or learning, it's part and parcel of getting your work done in the workflow, right? But we still have this sort of one interface that's presented and designed for helping you, speed along with not necessarily this kind of explicit intention about. I mean, if you want a creative ideation partner, you've got to say that explicitly and things like that. So I wonder, what I would be really interested in studying is, leaning into this idea of a rubber duck or of a tutor, and seeing, well, can we have a distinctive interface that prioritizes that kind of activity? Instead of saying, an AI that if you went and said, could you write this email for me? And instead of writing the email for you, it actually coached you to write a better email than you could have been able to write otherwise. Maybe that's not what you always want. Sometimes you just want it to do the thing. But if we have different options and alternatives in help people grow actually as individuals rather than basically offload their work to AI, those kinds of scenarios are things that I and Ian, I'm sure as well, would love to explore.
Very good. From my perspective, I'm happy to wrap it up here. So I appreciate that both of you took the time to go over the paper. I enjoy the discussion and wish you a great rest of the day.